Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Alexander. For those many new people here, we had 2 morning sessions, and now this is the poet session in the afternoon. So for those of you who are new, I'm Paul Alexander. I'm the director of the symposium, and I would like to welcome you to Hunter College and to Roosevelt House. And as I've pointed out, yes, the Franklin Roosevelts did live here from 1908 until they went off to the White House. So you can go around and look at the rooms and whatnot between sessions, because it really is a historical site, thinking that, whoa, Eleanor Roosevelt was sitting in this room. Oddly enough, while we're talking about Plath, to make the connection. This is, for many of you, you know that 23 marks the 60th anniversary of Sylvia Plath's death and the 90th anniversary of her birth year, which seem like landmarks that should warrant. Are we beeping somewhere? I think we're beeping down here, actually. Okay, how do we solve that? Because that will drive us crazy for an hour and a half. I know it's Ted Hughes. Yes, it's Olwyn. I think that.
If anyone has a hearing device, could you all check it? Someone check it, please.
I think we've located it.
Okay.
There we go. Well, on that happy note, where was I? So it seemed like an appropriate time to have a symposium celebrating her life, her work, her enduring literary legacy. I would like to thank President Jennifer Robb for supporting this event. Without her support, this would not have happened. She's funding the whole event, which is really unusual for a president to do these days for a poetry panel, a poetry symposium. So we thank President Robb. And I would also, yes. And I would also like to thank Harold Holzer, who is the director of Roosevelt House. His team and he have just been just phenomenal to work with. And so we really appreciate all of your work. This would not have happened without Harold either, so let's thank him. A couple of quick announcements. There are books on the first floor next to the front door that are available. Well, they're available all day long. So after the session, if you want to go up, they're Plath books and books written by the panelists. So please go up and look at the books. Mac will be up there with the book section. And at 5 o'clock today, on the first floor, we're going to have a reading by my students, of Plath's work from 5 to 5:30. So if you want to hear what appeals to this new generation of Plath admirers, you should go up, and it'll run for about 30 minutes. They're going to tell you why they respond to Plath's work, and they'll each read a poem. So that's 5 to 5:30 on the first floor. In what room?
The East Parlor.
The East Parlor, between 5 and 5:30. So please come up and hear the students. Like I said, we had 2 academic panels this morning. This panel is all poets. There are going to be 4 of them. And do we all know who they are? I mean, there's a program, yeah, so you all know who's going to speak. So to introduce each of the individual poets, I'm going to have one of my students come up and do the honors, and that's Ayesha Khan. She's going to come up today.
Donna Massini has been reading Sylvia Plath in one way or another since she was 17. It is the rare semester in which she does not teach Plath's poems and revisions in her graduate and undergraduate classes. Massini is the author of 3 collections of poems, 4:30 Movie and Turning to Fiction, both published by W.W. Norton & Co., and That King of Danger, winner of Barnard Women Poets Prize, which was published by Beacon Press. Her novel about Iwan, also published by Norton, came out in 1998. Of her poems, Adrienne Rich wrote, Donna Massini's poems are on the wavelength of Whitman and Rukeyser, but are intimately her own. Urban, sexual, working class, passionate, marked by great moral intelligence and generosity. She is one of the marvelous new poets this country is generating in a terrible time. Massini's work has appeared in Poetry, APR, Best American Poetry, Paris Review, Plowshares, 5 Points, and elsewhere. A recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts grant, a NIFA and Pushcart Prize, as well as fellowship residencies at Civitella Ranieri, Bogliasco, and Yaddo. She is a professor of English and creative writing at Hunter College and lives in New York City. She is currently at work on a new collection of poems, provisionally entitled Slaughter, etc.
Thanks, Aisha. Oh God, thanks to all of you. A lot of people here. Paul, thank you for putting this together. I had no idea you were going to pull it off. Seriously. Thanks for everyone who helped with it. Because, oh wait, I need my glasses. Because there are a lot of students and young writers in the audience, I decided to talk about Sylvia Plath as a mentor, to say what I learned from her, what and how you might learn from her. In every class I teach, undergrad or grad, I ask students to choose a mentor poet, someone they'll read throughout the semester. Read the poems, letters, journals, revisions, essays, and read the poets and writers they read, their influences. Perhaps trace images or narratives that repeat in various forms. This mentor is usually one of the great dead. When a student wants to choose, say, Terence Hayes or Louise Glick or Mark Doty or an ultra-contemporary writer, I say, fine, read them. That's your friend. But find out who they read. That will be your mentor. At the end of the semester, this happens a lot, they present their mentors. They try to entice the rest of the class to read their poet by showing how the poet influenced them. So in a way, this, what I'm doing today, is part pitch and part an account of reading and learning from Plath. One reason, I just want to show and tell, I don't have a little clicker or anything, but this is one of my copies of one of the Ariels, one of my many. They're all in pieces, no matter which version it is. Okay. One reason Plath makes such a great mentor is that as she didn't live long beyond her apprenticeship, it's possible to trace her extraordinary creative trajectory in a relatively short time. Another, she was an ardent student of poetry. She read and read and read and wrote and read and read and wrote. She worked indefatigably despite and through doubts and obstacles, and in the process, trained herself. She did exercises, practiced meter and syllabics, kept journals, notebooks, was at first a diligent reviser, later a brilliant, intuitive reviser. She is someone from whom young writers can learn the habit of art, as long as they avoid her mania for publishing. They can also see how some early poems, though full of wonderful effects, remain inert, strangled by language. But it is thrilling to watch the steady growth, the sudden leaps, and journals, letters, revisions, biographies. There is so much material to study. Finally, Plath seemed to understand from pretty early on, it's somewhere in the early journals, I couldn't find it, that a poem is not autobiography. A poem needs to transform experience. My relationship with Sylvia Plath began on Staten Island. One day, my mother, who is not what you would call a reader, Came home from Connie's beauty parlor with a copy of The Bell Jar someone had left by the dryers. It reminded her of her daughter, she told Connie, who let her take it home. The wit, I was electrified by this. My mother, as far as I knew, never picked it up again, but that Rosenberg opening, the irony, it would be another year before I found the poems. I was 16. Sylvia Plath has been one of my longest relationships. Though years later, at Hunter as it happens, I'd learned that Plath was called a confessional poet, what drew me initially to her poems was not story or drama, unless it was the drama of sound. Most of the poets I love come first through my ear. I was in love with Hopkins and Eliot, both huge influences on Plath, in high school, well before I read Ariel. I'd read and memorized them both. I didn't know what a Windhover was. I could not have said what Time's eunuch meant, even after I looked up the word. Hopkins reached me through my ear, my nerves. So too with Plath. She infiltrated me sonically. I didn't struggle to understand the poems, some of which were quite hermetic, any more than I struggled to understand Eliot or Hopkins. If her poems were confessional, it was often hard to know exactly what they were confessing. Rhythmically hypnotic and cantatory, these were poems that made me want to say them out loud. 3 days, 3 nights, lemon water, chicken water, water make me wretch. It's not an accident that both Hopkins and Plath were poets of great internal conflict, a conflict embodied in language, words, syllables, banging against one another. Through these poets, I learned to read intuitively with my nerves. I suggest to my students, some of whom are here, that they submit to the poems, that over the semester, their mentor poet will teach them how to read them. Understand their energies. It's like learning a new language. I want them to feel the way Plath's lines reverberate, her rhythms, her internal rhymes, like the twitchy repetitions of Macbeth's witches, how she binds a line, her associative leaps. I want them to see what I wouldn't have known to call tonal variety. When I first read Ariel and noticed how many things she could do, how many strategies, approaches, tones. She could taunt and attack, rant and grieve and threat, sing, rage, love, bless, confide, riddle, play, accuse, and the images, the unforgettable metaphors. Years I walked the streets with Plath repeating in me. Indefatigable hoof taps. Love set you going like a fat gold watch. Off, Ely tentacle. There is nothing between us. Her blacks crackle and drag. It is the noise that appalls me most of all, the unintelligible syllables. You do not do anymore, black shoe. Myself's dissolving, old whore petticoats. And this, the ending of the tender, synesthetic Nick and the Candlestick. Let the stars plummet to their dark address. Let the mercuric atoms that cripple drip into the terrible well. You are the one solid the spaces lean on, envious. You are the baby in the barn. I love to watch young writers begin to recognize a Plath poem as a performance, different from lyric or more meditative poems. What an astonishment Lady Lazarus was the first time I read it. I knew the Lazarus story, the cave, the grave clothes, the miracle. I'd obsessed over it, acted it out with my younger sister and brother, me, Lazarus, with a napkin on my face, wrapped in a pillowcase. My brother, Jesus, touches me and I pop up, blinking, alive again. I had unwrapped the bandages. Plath showed me how to unleash the mind, the psyche. This female Lazarus was fierce, relentless, mordantly witty. I think the poem was my first experience of what I would come to know as revisionary mythology. This was before I read H.D. or Bishop, what Glick, Clifton, Rich, so many women writers would soon do so brilliantly. Revisit, revise, reclaim the myth. While I'm talking about Lady Lazarus, let me clarify. I'm not saying that adolescent self-dramatization did not come into my love for Plath. The same depressed girl who sat in bed exclaiming to cease upon the midnight with no pain found great solace and power in performing this poem. Dying is an art, like everything else. I do it exceptionally well. I do it so it feels like hell, etc., etc. What I'm saying, though, is that a flat paraphrase of a poem, straight autobiography without the drama of sound, rhythm, image, repetition, structure, would not have moved me. This was art. Plath had transformed experience. When I began to write poems, by which I mean to go back to a scribbled-on piece of paper and try to revise it, I came back to Hunter to study with Audre Lorde. While here, I took a class on confessional poets, in which I read Berryman, Lowell, and Sexton for the first time. Only 4 people in the class. 4. And each was to study and present a poet. Of course, I chose Plath. I read and wrote on 3 Women, her radio play based on Ingmar Bergman, who I adored. I was asked to do an oral presentation on The Moon and the Yew Tree, a poem I hadn't paid much attention to. This is the light of the mind, cold and planetary. The trees of the mind are black, the light is blue. The grasses unload their griefs at my feet as if I were God, prickling my ankles and murmuring to me of their humility. Fumy, spiritus mists inhabit this place, separated from my house by a row of headstones. I simply cannot see where there is to get to. That killer declarative sentence that swerves away from the 6 previous image-freighted end-stopped lines, that knocked me out. But it would be years I'd be teaching the poem before I understood what, as a poet, Plath does next. The way she listened into what she had just written in order to see how to continue. In the white space, after the stanza, you feel her listening, waiting. I simply cannot see where there is to get to. Then, the moon is no door. It is a face in its own right, white as a knuckle and terribly upset. It drags the sea after it like a dark crime. It is quiet. How many things I tried after reading Plath to rhyme the last word of a line with the first word of a next line. Easier that than to achieve the lyric compression, the image that illuminates scientific fact with the perfect verb, drags. The simile that animates it, makes it mythic, atmospheric. That was genius. I wanted to do that. I still do. Often, I ask students to look at the verbs in that poem, the bells that startle the sky, the 8 great tongues affirming the resurrection, the way they soberly bong out their names. Meanwhile, Audre Lorde was asking me to write an anger poem. I couldn't do it. Oh, I could access the anger. I just couldn't write it, I told Audre. Anyone who wears boots like that, she wrote in her brown script, can write an anger poem. Then this, a colon, anger / lollipops. Well, that wasn't helpful. I went to Plath, just as she had studied Yeats' use of a mask. I used Plath as a mask. I wrote as if I were Plath, Lady Lazarus. Actually, I think I channeled Sylvia Plath and Audre Lorde and tried to write out of a combination of the two. You can imagine how bad those poems were. The equivalent of my napkin-faced Lazarus. I had simulated rather than transformed. My impulse was good, though, and I've seen many a student write beautifully using the kind of performative strategies borrowed from Plath or any number of contemporary poets. So now, I'm winding to a close. I want to thank all the biographers and editors and scholars, many of whom are here at this symposium, for what each new book, article, biography, edition, essay allows. When the collected poems came out, we suddenly saw that our Ariel was not Plath's Ariel. How much you discover about putting a book together by comparing what Hughes deleted, added, and reordered to make the Ariel we first knew with Plath's version, which was wildly different, with a wildly different trajectory. It's invaluable for young poets putting together their manuscript, a dramatic example of how the order determines a reading. Plus, there was The Rabbit Catcher, The Rival, all those poems we hadn't seen. It was astonishing. I continue. When Suzanne van Dyne's Revising a Life arrived, we could finally study the revisions of the Ariel poems. Whoops, where did I go? I began to use these revisions to teach, to look at how, in Ariel, the poem Plath cut the line in half, cut references to the horse to narrative markers, and with fragments, verbals, participles, and violent enjambments, moved from stasis, that substanceless blue, to the red eye, the cauldron of morning, realizing instinctively, you see how quickly she moved, draft after draft, the essence of the poem. Elm, edge, Medusa, words, poem after poem, we can see how quickly, instinctively Plath could revise a stalled poem at this point. I wish I had time to talk about the revisions. I'm going to take my class. You can do that. I cannot urge you strongly enough, you writers here, to find and study them. Finally, with the huge 2-volume letters and unabridged journals, we see for the first time Sylvia Plath, moviegoer. It shouldn't surprise me that this highly cinematic poet should have loved movies. She just never seemed to mention them. Now we see how she watched films, recorded them like writing down, not DVD, DVR. Recorded them with pen and paper, shot by shot, image by image, practicing juxtaposition, montage, the fragment, modernist and surrealist strategies she was already deploying. In a lovely essay called Sylvia Plath Goes to the Movies, the film critic Sheila O'Malley suggests what a fertile ground for study this would make. For the young poets here, I say, go to the movies, do what Plath did. Practice. So, how many of you want to take Plath on as your mentor poet? Okay. All right. See one back there. Okay. Thank you. Happy to be here. Next.
I will now introduce Eva Salzman. Eva Salzman's books include Double Crossing, New and Selected Poems, published by Blood Axe, and the anthology Women's Work, Modern Women Poets Writing in English, which she co-edited with Amy Walk. An associate lecturer at Goldsmiths University of London, and for many years a Royal Literary Fellow at Ruskin College, Oxford University, Salzman has worked extensively in schools on cross-disciplinary community projects and in prisons. Her writing has been broadcast on BBC Radio and widely published in journals such as the Times Literary Supplement, Poetry Review, and all the UK broadsheet newspapers like The Guardian. American publications include The New Yorker, Plowshares, and Kenyon Review. Salzman's father was a composer and naturalist, and her mother is an environmental activist, a background that has influenced her writing and teaching. Brooklyn-born, she's a dual citizen of the US and the UK. Her freelance work has taken her to Ireland and Europe, especially France and Spain. Salzman says, Plath's experience of English culture and its literature has a very loud, familiar ring to it. Her recent and current work includes an essay for the Scottish journal Dark Horse, a contribution to the book Between Fury and Peace, The Many Arts of Derek Walcott, published by Arrowsmith, and 2 poems which appear in the current online edition of Granta. Let's welcome Eva Salzman to the stage.
A lovely introduction, and just to echo, thanking everybody else and Paul Alexander for inviting me to this symposium. And I wasn't sure exactly how many students there'd be, and there are a lot more of you now than there were earlier today. I did not plan on you, although I teach you, or the version of you, in England. And in fact, England is actually what I'm going to talk about a lot, my experience of the culture, and alongside the culture's view towards Sylvia Plath as a sort of a touchstone for the way other women artists and women poets in particular are written about, which was something that I ended up doing in the introductory essay of the women's anthology that I wrote, which was only supposed to be about 4 pages long, and in the end was 20 pages long with 4 pages of notes. There were many, many, many things that I learned and experienced along the way that had me, that showed me the way that I had to write more than I had planned. Partly in order to write an introduction that was half thumbnail sketch, if you like, of the modern period and the women writing in it, and the other half was just pure rant about how few women still appeared in ostensibly mainstream anthologies. And this was especially the case in the UK anthologies that I looked at, which didn't surprise me at all. But I felt like I had to gather the numbers. However, I am going to start off with a more student-y directed thing, because it is about a more personal influence, and it's also referring to what T.S. Eliot may or may not have said: good writers borrow, great writers steal, which you may or may not have heard of. And it's questionable whether or not he said it. Some say that Oscar Wilde said. I've even read that Picasso was supposed to have said. Doesn't sound likely to me. In fact, if he did say it, it may have been immature writers borrow, mature writers steal, and I'm about to tell you about my own immaturity here. And I had long altered this to say to my own students in London, beginner writers borrow, professional writers steal, while always crediting Eliot appropriately, as he said it to begin with. I can think of one occasion when I borrowed, and I can think of another where I stole outright. The borrowing was conscious and deliberate. I wrote a sonnet about the Brooklyn Bridge, and I thought it was absolutely impossible not to steal Hart Crane's harp for that poem, so I just stole it. In fact, I don't even write it. I mean, I tell everybody that, because it's so obvious that it must be stolen. Plus, decades living abroad, I felt that I had more right to possess the bridge, having grown up virtually underneath it, than he did, because he'd only been there a mere few months. So this was my way of repossessing this bridge, and having. In terms of stealing his harp, I figured theft was the greatest praise one could give, and it was openly confessed. So therefore, borrowed, and not really a theft, and borrowed an illusion. But from Sylvia Plath, I stole outright, without even knowing it. I wrote in my first book a few lines, and I was so proud of them. And for all your trouble, you could see nothing but maybe a flurry of choughs, like ash blown between peaks. It's really the choughs that I'm referring to now, like ash blown between peaks. And I don't know if I'd forgotten the Plath poem or I'd not read it yet at that point, but I was so proud. And then after a while, the prouder I got, the more I thought was, maybe I didn't write this. So it was a little too good. So I kind of started to research back, and it really didn't take that long, because some of you may already be recognizing Blackberrying, which is actually it's a poem I identify with the Long Island landscape seems to be evoked in it. Overhead go the choughs in black cacophonous flocks, bits of burnt paper wheeling in a blown sky. Better than my version. However, different enough, I thought, anyway, you can tell me afterwards if you disagree, for me not to bother changing mine. Because after all, it was unconscious, unwitting, and I had absorbed and digested, and that is what happens a lot of the time when you're writing, and when you're writing as a young writer, and it does come out as an homage, and it comes out maybe a little differently, but referentially and sometimes identifiably, and it's not always a bad thing. It seems impossible to be a woman poet, or it should be impossible to be a man, or any other gender for that matter, and not be influenced by Emily Dickinson, mother of modernism before it even existed, and by Sylvia Plath, whose writing, as well as personal life, seems to symbolize certain crucial issues women poets and artists grapple with, practicing their art, not least of which is the conflict I, at any rate, feel almost invariably and incessantly talking about her private life and death, often at the expense of the work itself. There's the rub. Damned if you do, and damned if you don't. I'm going to read you just a few paragraphs not from the anthology, but from the another essay, because it seems that I've written about Sylvia Plath quite a lot, particularly in the last few years, and this is specifically about influences. Emily Dickinson, Elizabeth Bishop, and Sylvia Plath became the women poets who mattered most to my unformed poetic self. Unformed. I see now, that's not really, it's kind of funny to me, but I just had to have a little laugh there. I see now how each served as distinct influence. Dickinson as avant-garde iconoclast and modern, irrespective of when she lived. Her peculiar, enigmatic phrasing and intriguing shorthand presented inviting challenges. Having to clear through an underbrush towards meaning conferred value on process as distinct from product. Her aphoristic tell it slant resonated. Importantly, Dickinson turned the decidedly uncool black sheep role from a curse into a blessing. You don't understand me became a badge of honor instead of a tedious cri de coeur. At times, her writing sounds like a decorous mid-19th century fuck you. Bishop interested precisely because of her, to me, strange lack of drama, a coolness, lack of volatility, and less emotionally available intellectuality suggested ways to temper and contrast in order to highlight opposites, like going outdoors in order to feel better the warmth when coming back inside. Plath, the third member of the triptych, has been and often remains the problem child. And you'll have to excuse me, I've just moved house with a four-legged cat who I call jokingly a problem child. Who's very dear to me. I abandoned her not long after discovering her, Plath, congratulating myself prematurely for recognizing and relinquishing a preference I thought had arisen from a juvenile, unsophisticated perspective, only to find myself renouncing the renouncement soon afterwards. This revised epiphany and Plath's re-entry into my personal canon renewed a belief in the power of intuition and craft too. I found to my surprise, which I had totally overlooked in Plath's work until then, as have others perhaps, she was no mere accessory for the morbid adolescent after all. Well, you know how it goes. You know, you get something you're really keen on when you're a teenager, and then you decide you're getting more grown up, and then you have to give up all that stuff that you liked as a teenager, only to find sometimes that you were actually right to begin with. Now, Plath's my life living in England as a dual national has provided me with certain kinds of experience, quite a lot of experiences actually, that it's really hard not to parallel with Plath's life. And in fact, others also paralleled my life. And that kind of further affirmed that. Of course, I have no idea if her reactions to Britain, when I first got there in the early 80s, well, actually, the first time was 1980, it still seemed to have the kind of vestiges of World War II in a lot of ways. Spam, bad plumbing, not the weather. I mean, I understand why the British always talk about the weather, because it really sucks. It's never as cold as it is here, but I would rather it were colder and drier, because it's nearly as cold, but it's wet. I came down with pleurisy, which is also what you're supposed to do when you move to England, right? So when I read about, for example, that last few weeks of Plath's life and the freezing cold, and also the relationship with the neighbors, a certain kind of distance, everything like that invariably does kind of bring up memories that I have that are not dissimilar in certain ways. Also, my life did crisscross with some with people that Plath knew. Ruth Fainlight, to whom Plath has dedicated a poem, was well, she herself is originally an American, married to Alan Sillitoe, a British novelist, and apparently she made it a habit of befriending new American poets who moved to England, because that's what she and Alan did with me. So here was, the 1 degree of separation from Sylvia Plath. Al Alvarez also was someone who also befriended me, and I met a few times. I didn't know him quite as well as I know Ruth, who's a personal friend. But Al Alvarez is, as some of you may know, was very kind and also very attentive to and recognizing Plath's abilities and her poetry in the last few weeks of her life, even if he was keeping a distance to some extent personally. So there were all these different things, and there was the England I found to be, apart from the vestiges of Second World War, if you like, that's how I looked at it. It was also struck me as being much more sexist, quite anti-American, and quite anti-Semitic. And this comes from many years of different kinds of experiences, and subsequently, more recently, certain affirmations, those observations or my experiences of Britain in that way. And the sexism, of course, spills over into the literati, into the literary world, where the culture is already, imbalanced with the number. I mean, there was one woman editor, poetry editor in Britain, my editor for my second book at Oxford. And when the Oxford list no longer existed, there were no English women poetry editors in England, and that is still the case. There are a couple in Ireland. Yet many women students writing poetry and winning prizes. So those aspects of the culture. And then there was the fact that I moved in, or I lived with for 4 years, the Scottish poet Don Patterson. In fact, discovered his writing, which I read in manuscript. And that experience of being in a partnership with a northern, I mean, he's from Scotland, so further north than Ted Hughes is from Yorkshire, working class poet. I was then seen through that biographical lens and almost like called into action in order to speak as the American with the working class poet dude, which kind of pissed me off a lot of the time, as you can imagine, because my own poetry got cited. So there were a lot of experiences, and some of them were actually the opportunities sometimes to speak about the realities of being a woman poet, living with another poet who did not walk the dog or wash the dishes or do any of those chores. And at some point, I was even asked by the Times to write an article about living, and I made it light and joke, but I did write into it certain realities. And I got really blasted by the Times Literary Supplement, their opinion section. I was writing for them too, but I mean that's sort of separate. I mean I was writing reviews for them, and I was writing. They were publishing poems of mine, but they were, I got mentioned. I was mocked and derided for getting annoyed at the mentioning that my partner was in bed doing writing, because after all, that's exactly what he should be doing, was basically what it said. Fortunately, I got a riposte in a letter published, a riposte in. So there were aspects of one's life as one went on, and then you look back in retrospect, reading about Plath's life, and also her views of Hughes's success at that time, of course, resonated a lot. There's the writings about Plath by some English critics really got my attention, and I will. I think I'm probably running out of time, so I'm going to race through and just read you a couple of things that British critics wrote about Plath. See if I could find. Well, one thing that Adrienne Rich wrote was something that resonated with me, and something that I put into the anthology essay at the beginning. And she talks about an imaginative obsession with victimization and death unfair to Plath herself and her own struggle for survival. And this was something that really I gave a lot of. Let me see if I can find that one. 105, yes. 105. Plath is ground zero for what I call the fetishization of the damaged woman, and especially the damaged woman artist whose special talent is demeaned as accident, anomaly, or a symptom function of illness. This trope of the woman artist as damaged goods is another branch of the sexist tree. It resembles the woman on a pedestal, flattery employed to disguise invalidation, and elevation diminishing the person and her achievement. Vulnerability is usually regarded as a feminine quality, and its usage can switch seamlessly from being positive to pejorative. Numerous essays about Plath employ the word pathology, and the woman poet who kills herself is enhanced by virtue of death as the ultimate vulnerability. And I won't read any more of, that's me plagiarizing myself there, because we talked about Plath plagiarizing herself in the earlier. But that was one issue that I thought about a great deal as well. And I will read you, there are two excerpts from two critics writing about Plath. One of them was, the occasion was a series that was Faber and The Guardian, a collaboration between Faber and The Guardian, leading poets. And Margaret Drabble wrote about, was the chosen writer to write about Plath. And I forgot to say that with Don, when I was with Don, that Poetry Review would send him the boys' books to review, and I'd get all the girls' books to review. Stuff like that would happen. Let's see, what was I going to say? Oh, yes. Yeah, I think I'll read this. Drabble talks mainly about the birth poems. Well, I understand those are pioneering, and we talked about that today, and it's worth thinking about that, and it's important. However, maybe because I'm not a mother, it was notable to me that Margaret Drabble wrote and I won't read it out now because I think I'm running out of time, but she talked with great distaste about other aspects of Plath's poems that she found really difficult to talk about until she got, and then she settled into writing about the birth and the mother poems. And I thought that was, it's very, I'm not reading it to you now, but it was very telling the way she was not comfortable, and I found that to be true with other critics as well, not comfortable with talking about many, many more of the difficult and often, I think, more interesting aspects of Plath, and whether it's anger and complexity and things that are not easy, and settled back into the talking about maternity and the other, and I don't think I have time to find this quote either, was James Fenton, whose books I used quite a great deal teaching, particularly his books about craft. And I came across an essay of his that he wrote about Sylvia Plath. And several things. He talks about the kind of iconic poet as being the male poet and the priest. He talks about Judeo-Christianity and how it's male. So that was already bothering me. But then he also talks about how if we knew nothing of her when we first read her. She was the latest American favorite poet, is what he says. And I thought, well, so what? American. And then he said, and she was not yet the feminist manifesto she would become. And that really, I mean, there were so many things to object to, because I thought to myself, well, her poetry isn't feminist manifesto anyway. It was, if she became a feminist manifesto, it's because of others who, so that was not unlike, those were the kinds of criticism that I would read about Plath, which didn't surprise me at all, and were representative and indicative of aspects of the British literati culture and a kind of embedded sexism that I experienced myself. And I wanted to go back to personal influences, but I think I am running out of time. So I just threw at you the opportunity to slag off the Brits, which I never passed that up. And thank you very much.
To introduce Honor Moore. Honor Moore's newest book, Our Revolution, A Mother and Daughter at Mid-Century, was published recently by W.W. Norton. Moore's previous memoir, The Bishop's Daughter, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and a Los Angeles Times Favorite Book of the Year. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Paris Review, The American Scholar, and many other journals and anthologies. For the Library of America, she edited Amy Lowell, selected poems as well as poems from the women's movement, an opera summer reading list section. She has been poet in residence at Wesleyan University and the University of Richmond, visiting professor at the Columbia School of Arts, and 3 times the visiting distinguished writer in the nonfiction writing program at the University of Iowa. When still in her 20s, Morning Pictures, her play in verse about her mother's death, was produced on Broadway. The White Blackbird, A Life of the Painter Margaret Sargent by her granddaughter, published in 1996 and recently reissued, was a New York Times notable book. Moore lives and writes in New York, where she is on the graduate writing faculty of the New School. Honor Moore's papers are held at the Arthur and Elizabeth Schlesinger Library at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, Harvard University. Let's welcome Honor Moore to the stage.
Hi there, everyone. Just because I'm here as a poet, my 3 books of poems are Memoir, Red Shoes, and Darling. I wear 2 hats, it seems. Here is my copy of Ariel. I want to thank Paul and President Rob and everyone who came together to organize this sort of amazing celebration of women poets, poetry, and the great Sylvia Plath. And I also want to just speak to my great influences in the era of the sort of what I think of as the golden age of women poets when I was coming of age as a poet. Muriel Rukeyser, June Jordan, Audre Lorde, Sonia Sanchez, and Adrienne Rich. Living at the time, aside from the one who had left. I've written a little something called Ariel as Entrance, and I just want to start by reading one of my favorite poems of Plath, but it seems sort of relevant to what I'm talking about. The Applicant. First, are you our sort of person? Do you wear a glass eye, false teeth, or a crutch, a brace or a hook, rubber breasts or a rubber crotch, stitches to show something's missing? No? Then how can we give you a thing? Stop crying. Open your hand. Empty? Empty. Here is a hand to fill it and willing to bring teacups and roll away headaches and do whatever you tell it. Will you marry it? It is guaranteed to thumb shut your eyes at the end and dissolve of sorrow. We make new stock from the salt. I noticed you are stark naked. How about this suit? Black and stiff, but not a bad fit. Will you marry it? It is waterproof, shatterproof, proof against fire and bombs through the roof. Believe me, they'll bury you in it. Now your head, excuse me, is empty. I have the ticket for that. Come here, sweetie, out of the closet. Well, what do you think of that? Naked as a paper to start, but in 25 years she'll be silver, in 50 gold, a living doll, everywhere you look. It can sew, it can cook, it can talk. It works. There is nothing wrong with it. You have a hole, it's a poultice. You have an eye, it's an image. My boy, it's your last resort. Will you marry it? Marry it? Marry it? The Applicant. We were always sort of asking in those days, am I your sort of person? Anyway, let me just make sure I have everything together here so I don't. Anyway, reading that poem again this past Sunday morning, I find myself in tears. These days, I'm not sure what the present is, as voices from the past crowd in and images. What would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? The world would split open. The fierce, deep voice of Muriel Rukeyser in 1968, how now oddly resonates again. Every time a woman is misunderstood, denied an abortion or a job, misread, raped, made miserable at the bluntness of patriarchal limitation. It's not so much a particular Sylvia Plath poem that continues to inspire me. Tulips, Lady Lazarus, Edge, though they come back sharp, jagged, magnificent. Rather, it is that voice. Band-Aid ripped off, lid exploded, finger burnt or cut, red soup on a floor, the possibility of disaster in a kitchen catastrophe. She turned on an oven to die. In The Situation and the Story, Vivian Gornick writes of discovering a new voice of her own. I finally had a narrator strong enough to do battle for me. Devotion to this narrator became in time an absorption that went unequaled. I longed each day to meet up with her, this other one, telling the story that I alone, in my everyday person, would not have been able to tell. She had become the instrument of my illumination. Each morning, I couldn't wait to be in her company. This narrator had come to her while writing her memoir, Fierce Attachments, in remembering the voices around the kitchen table of her mother and her mother's friends in the Bronx in the 1950s. Sitting at my desk 20 years after that, let's say in 1971, writing my first poems, I feel the old black rotary phone to my ear and hear my mother's confiding voice. Have you read this new woman poet? It was Sylvia Plath she was talking about. I must already have known of the suicide and the dead of a frigid winter, leaving behind small children, but it was Plath's voice my mother wanted to tell me about. My mother, who'd had 9 children, then written a book published the year after Plath took her own life. My mother, who died at 50, 2 years after that phone call, who was a voracious reader who called me with excitement to exclaim over this or that woman writer. Christina Stead, The Man Who Loved Children, Elizabeth Bowen, The Death of the Heart, the poems of Gwendolyn Brooks, the latest Muriel Spark. Ariel is the name of her book, she said. I soon had a copy of the Faber edition that had been published in England in 1965. The jacket was slate blue on yellow, a dark maroon stripe at the bottom. I don't know why my mother had discovered Plath right then, as Ariel had appeared in the US a few years earlier in 1966. Was it that I was starting to write poems and she wanted to encourage me? Or perhaps it was that she, the mother of 9 children and veteran of babies, had found herself in Plath. One cry and I stumble from bed. In the young woman born in Boston as she had been, who'd spent time in a mental hospital as she had, I see myself flat, ridiculous, a cut paper shadow. It moves me now to imagine that in Sylvia Plath, my mother was seeking a way to communicate more intimately with her 20-something new poet daughter. Recently, I found myself saying to my students, all but one in the class women and the man, a man of color, I am so sick of being nice in my writing. Do not be nice. Your writing is a place where you do not have to be nice. It is a refuge from nice. There I was at 77, raving to young writers not to fall victim to limitation, the walls I have spent my life knocking down, only to have them rise up again like the mutation of a virus. The vows section of the New York Times, for instance, celebrating a new courtship where seemingly intractable problems are worked through with self-regarding smugness, a new courtesy. Even as in the same newspaper, you find a raw account of a woman's life by a male columnist and feminist, writing of a woman in India first raped and trafficked at 12, compelled by lack of other opportunity still to make her living as a prostitute, her 2 little boys under the bed where she does her work because the apartment is so small, there's no other space. Her husband out driving a taxi because even her sex work doesn't pay all the bills. Sylvia Plath was one of the poets with Anne Sexton and Robert Lowell, whom the critic M.L. Rosenthal identified as confessional. Nomenclature deployed at the time by conservative critics to dismiss the genius of a new literary movement. As a woman brought up in high church Episcopalianism, I regularly made my confession in a small dark closet, the confessor behind a grill so I could barely see him. Yes, him. Yet, after confession, there came a thing called absolution. I remember the feeling so well, emerging from the dark box, a sense of my shortcomings dissolving in new air. To extend the metaphor, if there were an absolution I'd ask for women writers today, it would be release from any fear or shame that still holds us back from the truth. A return of the cool, fresh wind of a moment when grounded in the voice of Sylvia Plath, a generation of women poets made new stock of the salt as our bald cry took its place among the elements. I'm going to end with Plath's poem, Words. Axes, after whose stroke the wood rings, and the echoes traveling off from the center like horses. The sap wells like tears, like the water striving to reestablish its mirror over the rock that drops and turns, a white skull eaten by weedy greens. Years later, I encounter them on the road, words dry and riderless, the indefatigable hoof taps, while from the bottom of the pool, fixed stars govern a life. Thank you.
Three women poets here. Obviously, Plath has affected you in some way. Can you talk more specifically how maybe she affected your work in one way or another?
Well, I guess part of what I was trying to say was that push. You know, one thing I remember Ted Hughes saying is that Plath never left even the slightest scrap of something she'd written unfinished. And I've taken that. That's one thing. The other thing is that idea of the raw, the to the bone voice, the always kind of stripping away the courtesy, the politeness, what I called the niceness. And that's not nothing. I mean, that's like a spur. And to keep remembering / imagining this young woman in a strange country, even before she went to England in a strange country, continuing to do that.
And it sounds like at the time, London maybe was even more conservative than we imagined.
And is this working?
Yes,
Is it,
yeah,
yeah?
they control it up there.
Okay.
But talk or they can't hear you on Zoom at home. You have to talk to you.
Yeah, and even now. But I did want to respond to, because my first introduction, I told you my first introduction and then renouncement and then renouncing the renouncement. But my first draw with Plath was absolutely her language and her imagery. It was, so even though there's all that dark, teenage angst stuff, it was that kind of, I mean, I would mouth her words, the language, and the images, and think about what was it that made them so apt and so precise and dangerous. I mean, really, there was something kind of dangerous about it. So it was nothing, and I didn't even really recognize how deft she was with craft even at that point, but I definitely was drawn to the language and to the images, and she set an impossibly high bar. And that was all that was going to be good enough, was an impossible high bar to write well.
I think I already said a lot about how she influenced me. And yes, as I said, it was first sonically through her language. It was language. It was never, it wasn't story. It was.
Yeah, at the core of language somehow.
And all those tones, all those attacks, she made me want to try things. But I think there's certain poets that are too deep a part of you to even be able to say how they influenced. So I'll say that.
Who has questions? I will bring the mic to you. Do you have a question? Yes. You and then you.
Hi, Donna. I have a question for y'all. Where do you think Plath's work would have gone? Because we can see in her revisions just the sleekness of her lyric voice, which is what always drew me to her. I'm just curious, where do you think it would have? What poetic direction do you think she would have staked out after Ariel?
I think of Ariel as an unfinished project. I mean, I think we think of it as being some sort of ending of hers, and certainly, the poem, there are poems kind of, foretelling perhaps her death, but, I think the poet didn't know the poet was going to die and that the poet didn't die. So I would say, I don't know what the poems would have been, but I don't think she was finished with where Ariel had taken her.
I think that, what happens with sometimes with successful poets is that they begin to then repeat themselves and, you know, and sometimes even parody themselves. And there's often that concern. I mean, I think all poets or all writers have that concern about, you know, not repeating yourself. And that you could foresee that, except that you have to really look at how she wrote and how incredibly original and extraordinary she was in her use of language and her use of metaphor. And I think one must derive from that we can't know, but that it would have been an interesting place.
No, I think, especially after I read Heather Clark's beautiful biography, really what I was thinking mostly of is why didn't she have Zoloft? And what could her life have been had she had women friends and had she just hung on she wasn't even in the 60s. I mean, she was before the Beatles, the Kennedy assassination, everything. She was so deeply political. That's what I learned from Heather Clark's book. I think she would have become more and more political, and the poems would have been more and more. I think she still would have had that sense of a poem transforms, but I think she would have, I'm thinking of something else too. I'm thinking about some of the things that she cut out of poems, like I may be skin and bones, I may be Japanese. There were ways that the poems we would have known had more a sense of her, and there would have been less to attack, I think.
Would there have been more novels?
Well, the novel that was destroyed.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
yeah.
Who knows? I mean, I don't know. I actually just prefer to think about, if I think about her continuing, I just could.
Well, if he's thinking about career, for example, Margaret Atwood springs to mind, who could do both, one better than the other, I would argue. But maybe that's the case with Plath, too.
It's hard not to think about her as being, where generationally, where she was. I mean, that kind of drive to perfection, that was, across the board. It was about her art, but it was also drive to perfection to be a perfect wife as well. And then the despair to fail in those areas. And I mean, those conflicts, I think, certainly in my generation, I can recognize that in myself to some extent, but certainly the previous generation, I could see the juggling that conflict all the time. And, people have talked about her conformist qualities in a way that's, like inexplicable. But I think she was grappling with, very conflicting things that come out of that age.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have to just say something to Paul. Mark is at Hunter.
He went to the wrong place.
Yeah.
I thought that was going to happen.
Okay. Sorry, I'm texting him.
Okay. Can you tell him where we are? 65th Street.
I think we almost can't imagine how much, quote, every woman had to have a husband, give dinner parties, and dress the lovely children. I mean, it was really not, so you can't really say that Plath was idiosyncratically obsessed with all of that. The entire generation was idiosyncratically obsessed with all of that.
I mean, most of the women that I know in Britain changed their names upon marriage. I didn't when I first got, I never did, but I had to for my bank account.
Oh, my God.
I mean, and that's in the 80s. That's in the 80s. That's mid-late 80s.
Honor Moore, that the long passage you read, that was from Vivian Gornick?
Yes,
Okay, thank you. I was just
the
puzzled.
situation and the story.
Okay, thanks so much. I didn't know she was Episcopalian, but
No,
thank you.
I'm
That was
the
you.
Episcopalian.
Okay. All right. So
I'm gonna tell Vivian you said that, though.
I know, it was a shock to me too. Thank you.
About what you have written, correct?
Well, right back there?
Yes. Yeah, the bishop's daughter.
I have little knowledge on Plath, but I wanted to ask, what effect do you think she left on today's women writers and poets?
Influence on today's poets, today's writers?
Well, I think
Isn't
that
everybody
I
affected by
think that
Plath in
every
some way?
every young, I mean, I assume, maybe wrongly, that every young woman poet will get to Plath at some point. No?
Not at Barnard, apparently.
Yeah, I mean, that,
My daughter's alma mater, they don't teach Sylvia Plath. I don't
that was a bit
understand
of a
that.
shockaroo, wasn't it?
Yeah. No, I don't think it's, okay, wait, we have two more questions. Okay, but I don't think it's a given that people will, that any young woman poet is going to get to Plath.
Unless we give it to her.
Well, isn't that why we're doing this?
Yes, exactly.
Look.
Hello. As someone that's kind of still in that, I guess you would say, teenage ink stage, and is likely a little unable to fully understand the depth and craft that Plath has, what is, I guess, kind of not advice, but a direction you think I could take to become a better poet and better understand and become a more holistic writer?
What's your name?
Sideria Leecraft.
Sideria? Sideria, you're reading the poems, right? You know, like I said before, the poems will teach you how to read them. Find poems and read them out loud. Don't try to read like the entire book. You know, find a few and just read them over and over. The first poets I loved, I was lucky I was in all-girl Catholic school at a certain point, and I just lucked into a great English teacher. But, you know, and I think you have a great English teacher too, right? But just read and read and read, and go back and find things you loved and read them again. And, you know, read and write and read and write, and just, you know, try to go back and not expect the first thing you write on the page to be the poem. You know, it's going to be draft after draft after draft. And it takes a long time. Well, for some people. For me, it did.
I actually don't think you need to worry all the time about understanding everything. I mean, if you think of it as music, which is what we've been talking about, and I really think this, my first response when I like something is I have no idea why I like it. I have to sit there and figure it out, and I like it that way around. If my editor or my critic was sitting there with me, it would just not be the same experience as the immersion into literature the way it should be, which is that should be instinctive and intuitive, and then you can sit back and think about what it means. I remember teaching some dancers and giving them, and they wanted to write better about dance. They weren't really interested in poetry, but I was giving them a poetry and a workshop. That's what they wanted. And I said, I want you to read all this. And but we don't understand. I said, I just want you to read. And then I said, okay, what about this in the third line? What do you think this? Oh, I'm not really sure. I said, just don't worry about it. Just tell me what you think. And they got it right every single, they entered into the images, and they were afraid to, you know, that they were wrong, but they weren't. They read the images and they got the images. But don't worry if you don't understand anything. It's good that way.
Hey, I love what basically both or all three of you said about, you know, reading orally, reading intuitively, reading instinctually. But I do have a question that, Donna, you mentioned that, and I've seen it a bit in her letters, Plath's letters, but how do you think her mania for publishing maybe inhibited her? Was she was really concerned with readers or with editors?
You know, she did what she needed to do. Mm-hmm. I think, like, for my students, I'm like, you know, just don't worry about it so much. I'm not going to criticize anything Plath did. She did fine. I think this morning, even, I think Amanda was talking about her delight. She pretty much tried to publish everything she did. And that's fine too. If that was the thing that was spurring her on, if she needed it, whatever she needed it for, or if she just wanted to communicate, that's fine, that's great. for me, it would be not a great thing to be, sort of writing something and stuffing it in an envelope and sending it out. Well, we don't even do that anymore, but also to, I mean, plus at that time you sent something out and it came back in the next post. Now it's like, 6 months later, you're like, but yeah, so I didn't mean to criticize her, but I think it's not a great thing for young poets to do.
Well, aren't you talking about the inhibition from being rejected? I mean, that's the thing. That's the risk always is, you send something out and you're rejected. And, if you're young and you're new at it, it's much easier because you don't have 89 million other publications to say, I'm no good. Why am I doing this? And to stop doing it. That's the point. And I always say to my MFA students, this is your time to write. This is your time to be in community about your writing. That will come later.
Hi, just about everyone concerned about the lack of Plath education at Barnard. I will try my hardest. But I was just wondering, this is more of like a cute question, I suppose. Like, what was the first Sylvia Plath poem that pulled you in? And then like, now maybe what you think, like if something gets changed. Like I know the first poem that brought me in is like a classic, like Daddy, but like now I'm much more like focused on like the moon and the yew tree or an edge. And like, I guess that shows a maturity of angst, perhaps, but I'm wondering what your experience was with that.
Oddly, I can guess. I think it might have been Edge. The woman is perfected, her dead. and then that white space, right? And then the sounds of it. The poem, the sounds of that poem just really, and it was really moved slowly. It was static, right? It's a beautiful poem. If we had time, we would just recite it now.
Actually, the poems, the Lady Lazarus and Daddy Came After, Sheep and Fog was one of the first poems that I loved of hers. I really don't know why, except there was something about the evocation of that. She's always able to find the language to evoke so specifically the sensation of that, of what she's describing, the landscape.
That Fat Gold Watch line. Morning Song, even it seems to be the first poem in the book, which implies that I never went further, but that's not true. But that, I think, there's something about Fat Watch, something about that embodying language applied to an object really struck me, really.
You'll have to forgive me, I'm an engineer among poets, so my entire body of knowledge regarding Plath is restricted to what I heard today. Forgive me, Eva. I'm struck by the notion, the description of Plath as the first confessional poet, and it seems to me much of this discussion today and what I've heard is gendered. What is the influence on women poets and so forth? And so men of my generation, it's been noted that we do not have an emotional vocabulary. Men are raised to be people of action. And when we have these conflicting feelings, these emotions, we don't have the words for it. So while this discussion has been gendered and aimed, it seems to me, at women, what value do you think Plath has for men?
I mean, I think that the word, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the confessional was first applied to Robert Lowell.
Robert Lowell, yeah.
So it was not applied to her, and also it's a word and a phrase that is often misused and abused, in my opinion, but not just in my view. So I think it's often been understood, particularly in a place like England, where there's kind of a lot of pigeonholing. You know, so that question can run and run.
Well, it's often used it often has been used, sort of in our generation, as a put down.
Yeah, it is.
Oh, it's just confessional poetry, as if a poem which is ostensibly seems autobiographical or narrative is not transformed.
I'm not sure it always applies to
And we have Mark Doty here, so we can continue this later.
Mark Doty is a renowned author of poetry and prose. He is the author of 3 memoirs: the New York Times best-selling Dog Years, Firebird, and Heaven's Coast, as well as a book about craft and criticism, The Art of Description, World into Word. Throughout his writings, he shows special interest in the visual arts, as is evident in his poems and also in his book-length essay, Still Life with Oysters and Lemon. His most recent book is a memoir that centers on his poetic relationship with Walt Whitman, entitled What is the Grass? Doty is the author of 9 books of poetry, most recently Deep Lane, Fire to Fire, New and Selected Poems, was published in 2008 and won the National Book Award. Doty is the first American poet to have won Great Britain's T.S. Eliot Prize for My Alexandria, which also received both the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award. His other volumes of poetry include Turtle, Swan, Atlantis, Sweet Machine, Source, and the critically acclaimed volume, School of the Arts. Doty has also received 2 NEA fellowships, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Withing Writers Award, a Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Award, and the Witter Bynner Prize. In 2011, he was elected a Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. He is a distinguished professor at Rutgers University and teaches in NYU's Low Residency MFA program in Paris. Let's welcome Doty.
Hi. I'm not even going to make any excuses for myself. It's boring, right? I'm happy to be here. And I want to just pick up on the tail end of the conversation I was hearing. The term confessional was first used by a critic named M.L. Rosenthal to describe Robert Lowell's book Life Studies. And it seems to me that it was a misnomer from the very beginning, because confession implies that one wants absolution, that you want to be forgiven for something. Lowell's not asking to be forgiven, he's asking for insight. And so the poems are really more like a monologue given to a psychiatrist or a therapist than they are to a priest. And so, but that word has stuck so insidiously that now, gosh, it's been 20 years ago. I was teaching at Sarah Lawrence, and I had a 19-year-old in my office saying, I really want to write. I said, well, what are you interested in? He said, I want to write poetry, but I don't want to write confessional poetry. I said, what do you want to write about? He said, my life. So, yeah, that's where we are with that. And it remains that confusing, that muddle. It's a term that, it's kind of used to look down on certain kinds of experience, particularly that of women, and of people who are mentally troubled. So, I am going to give a little talk about probably my favorite Sylvia Plath poem. And here we go. Does this sound okay? You hear in the back? Okay, all right. So years ago, Jean Valentine, my late wonderful friend, told me a story. Jean had published her first book, a Yale Younger Poets Prize winner, in 1965. She had completed a second manuscript, one she had confidence in, and just around that time, some copies of the as yet unpublished Ariel began to circulate among poets. Jean read the book, and here my memory blurs just a little. Either she took her manuscript and put it away, or she had already given the manuscript to her publisher and asked for it back. One of those two. She set that manuscript aside. She never gave it to the publisher, or she returned it. She had to. She said that it was Plath's courage that required this. Ariel was spur, challenge, and permission all at once. Don't we dream of reading a book like that? One that seems to say, look what's possible. Look what can be done. Poems have an extraordinary power when they arrive in the hands of readers who need them, when they seem to speak directly to us. This power derives in part from the content of the work, the reports they bring from what has gone unsaid, unexamined before they arrive. But poems that galvanize readers in the way that Ariel did and still does can't be simply statements about the way lives are lived. The statement of a poem lives in the way that poem comes to life as an artful construction, a made thing that can, when all its elements work to create a seamless experience for the reader, do something very like what we usually think impossible. It can tell us what it's like to be in the skin of another person. We're not supposed to be able to know that. Critical theory says you can't know that. Psychology says you can't know that. You read a great poem, and you kind of know that, right? Kind of, at least a version of a life. So the superbly controlled explosion of Ariel has been absorbed into literary culture, by which I mean read by generations, loved, denounced, edited, reduced to biography, no offense, not about you, held answerable to theories of gender and power, canonized, dismissed, and read by generations more. It exists within a large machinery of interpretation through multiple lenses and in many contexts. Some of them in popular culture. Any House of Cards fans here? Okay, so you may have seen then, in one of the late episodes, the wonderful actor Robin Wright is playing the vice president. Her husband, the president, is in a coma, so she's the acting president, but she wants the full title for herself. And she, wrapped in a white slinky dress, she's sort of writhing around on a staircase, supposedly in the White House, and she recites most of Lady Lazarus. Without credit, just there's the poem. It's credited in the title. But so here is the vice president saying, "I eat men like air." Quite a moment, huh? Okay, so I shouldn't be surprised that the incendiary, accusatory, performative poems should get most of the airtime. Splashy, grotesque, and often darkly comic, these poems were taught to me as an undergraduate earnestly, without acknowledgement of their humor, or the way the speaker seems clearly enthralled and exhilarated by her own performance, her chant and spell. No one who's read those poems or heard them recited is likely to forget them. They sear their way into the reader's awareness with a remarkable combination of rage, condemnation, self-laceration, and a scarily exhilarating sense of empowerment that comes from embracing what in the psyche the culture demands that we reject. Lady Lazarus is embracing her own suicide attempts. Daddy is just wallowing in a combination of hatred and eros around the father, right? So, to utterly hate a father is a way of being profoundly attached to him. Such an obsessive attachment, charged with eros and loathing, seems unlikely material for a sardonic, rollickingly rhythmic chant of denunciation, just as figuring the difficult men who shaped one's life as Nazi torturers, while celebrating one's recurrent suicide attempts could be read as narcissistic, inflations of one's own pain. But the mode of these two poems is headlong, and they make no apologies as they swell with the mounting exhilaration of wrapping oneself in blazing defiance. I stand in awe of these poems. Their insistence and force and their aggressive deployment of rhyme and meter make them feel public, as if their ferocious spells might, if chanted properly, perform a work of exorcism and personal liberation before a spellbound crowd. And I've written some public poems myself, in which a speaker who feels larger than my workaday self takes on the prohibitions of the Christian right, or proclaims the marvel of drag as if to free his people, or at least create a zone of freedom around himself. So I get it, but I admit these are not my favorite Plath poems. This semester, I've been teaching a course on late 20th century American poetry at Rutgers, and what a wonder it is to read Plath again. The poems of hers that delight me most are the ones that feel closer to home, more attempts at understanding than performative exorcisms. One of my favorites is Morning Song, a poem in which the speaker is less on stage or at a podium than she is in a space of intimacy, one in which she contemplates the unlikely, barely knowable being that has emerged from her own body. And has somebody read this poem today? Have you heard it already? Okay, here it comes. All right, anyway, okay. It's a beautiful thing. Just so you maybe sort of visualize it, 6 stanzas, but each is a tercet. It's fairly short. Morning Song. Love sets you going like a fat black watch. Sorry, love sets you going like a fat gold watch. The midwife slapped your foot soles, and your bald cry took its place among the elements. Our voices echo, magnifying your arrival. New statue in a drafty museum, your nakedness shadows our safety. We stand round blankly as walls. I'm no more your mother than the cloud that distills a mirror to reflect its own slow effacement at the wind's hand. All night your moth breath flickers among the flat pink roses. I wake to listen, a far sea moves in my ear. One cry and I stumble from bed, cow-heavy and floral in my Victorian nightgown. Your mouth opens clean as a cat's. The window square whitens and swallows its dull stars. And now you try your handful of notes. The clear vowels rise like balloons. Now, so, let's see. Just so further about the poem offers us 6 tercets. In 2 of these, at the beginning and 2 at the end, there are 2 lines longer than the third. In the middle 2 stanzas, there's 1 line in each that's shorter than the other 2. I think the only reason for that is for the poet's pleasure. It doesn't advance meaning. I think it gives Sylvia something to distract herself while she's writing the poem. You can pay attention to that form while you're talking about rather difficult things in a way. A sense of distance from your own child, of not knowing how to approach this strange being that has emerged from you. Okay. It's form is sometimes a hedge against anxiety, right? If you can pay attention to that, then your own nervousness or fear can be set aside. And anxiety is certainly on stage here. This poem is concerned with the uncanny otherness of the baby and the mother's discomfort with this new, seemingly incomprehensible presence. But despite that, it's not a dire poem, but one in which the strangeness of becoming a parent gives way to a sense of wonder, maybe even of incipient delight. I'll get to that, but I want to linger a bit first on the pleasures to be found before it arrives at its conclusion. They are manifold. Every line here offers unexpected and provocative figuration and sonic textures that underscore or embody the content of the line. I think Plath may be the brightest exemplar of Keats' rule that the poet should load every vein with ore. Every one of these lines is yielding something. You never feel like you're just advancing a plot or going forward to find out what happens. You stop and take in some remarkable phrasing, some bit of metaphor that is unexpected, some kind of music. So, the poet has a remarkably adept visual apparatus, the linguistic capability to make us see what she sees, and the skill of building the sort of music that does that reliably magical work of making the words that are said feel real to us. This, I think, is one of poetry's grandest accomplishments, that somehow, it's the same thing as what I was talking about the model of subjectivity. Language can make us perceive something in 3 dimensions, can make us feel we can enter it, and the best example is Shakespeare. Think about Midsummer Night's Dream, And when Oberon wants that flower, and Puck says, "I know a bank where the wild thyme blows," and you feel the moisture on the leaves. You see the flowers shining in the dark, the whole damp, magical space. That's what sound is for in this instance. So, the first stanza offers us the first of a lot of startling images. Love sets you going like a fat gold watch. And I love, there's a rhythmic surprise in that. Love sets you going like a fat gold watch. It's almost like a jump rope, right? And that image, something being set going like a watch, recalls the notion of the deist theology, that the creator made the world, this perfect machinery, set it in motion and walked away. So love set you going like a fat gold watch. Love made you, and there you are. What do I do with you? It's not our love or my love, it's love that sets you going. So the baby has come from some abstract force. Likening the infant to, okay, let's see. It's not the parent's agency, it's the agency of love. If we think of the title in relation to the first line, okay, love set you going like a fat, I can't keep doing it. Love set you going like a fat gold watch. Here are the vowels that you would hear. E, U, O, I, O, ah. All of that, okay? And those are clear vowels rising like balloons. It's bubbling, and it's weird. It's a lot of work for your mouth to do that over the course of a line. It makes the line seem longer and thicker. At birth, this child's cry seemed nothing human. It was one of the elements, less a living sound than some anonymous, impersonal instance of order. The initial figures used to characterize this little one are inorganic: watch, statue, mirror. It's 3 stanzas before things look up at moth and cat. And then right now, there's a bassinet, a baby that seems enormous because it is incomprehensible, an adult and an echo, and blank walls that suggest an absence of personality. So the nursery is a place where the furniture has been moved out, I would guess, to make room for the bassinet, the crib. There's nothing in there but the baby, and it echoes. She talks about, this is the second stanza, we stand round blankly as walls. Our voices echo, magnifying your arrival. So there's that sense of a space they don't quite know how to use. I think the mother, we stand round blankly as walls. It's sort of a suggestion of the infinite, maybe as infinite as tabula rasa. Is this baby someone? Is it a blank slate? And the mother is feeling pretty blank too. What do I do? How do I handle this? So each stanza is giving us an unexpected view of this weird phenomena in the crib. But the third one is a tour de force, a really remarkable stanza. It is a single sentence, and here it is. And it's a little hard sentence to follow. You're going to spend some time with this one. I'm no more your mother than the cloud that distills a mirror to reflect its own slow effacement at the wind's hand. Okay, so I'm no more your mother. Line break, that's what we read first. And that really distills what the speaker's experiencing so far in the poem. I'm not your mother. I'm not bound. Oh, are you? Who am I in this relation? But I'm no more your mother than the wind, than the cloud that distills the mirror. So as the cloud drops its rain, there's a puddle on the ground, there's water. The cloud sees itself in the mirror. And what does it see? Its own slow effacement, the cloud being erased and blown away. So what a figure for mother and child. In your body, in your face, I see myself reflected. We have genetics in common. We have this bond, but time is making my life shorter. I'm approaching later in my life, making your life longer. And as I move this way, you move this way. So there's a kind of aching paradox in that, right? The wind, there's the cloud looking at itself, there's the mother looking at herself. It's a beautiful figure of time. And it slows us down because you have to figure it out. So you have to spend some time with that. And because it's one sentence, it's a stall in mid-poem. It's like we've been moving pretty quickly. And then, oh, what's happening there? And the tone has shifted just a little bit because the cloud and the mirror are linked. They are inextricable from one another. And that suggests that the mother and the baby are inextricable in some way. They are bound in time, in a time relationship. Right? I think, I keep seeing this image there of a tarot deck. There's a card where there's a hand coming out of a cloud, you know that? And it's holding a cup. And is that the one of cups, maybe? I'm not sure either. It's a French deck, and it looks like that. And Plath knew her tarot. It's referred to in Lady Lazarus, I think, in other poems too. And it is a kind of mysteriously beautiful image of a gift coming to you, as if that sort of occult or sacred image has offered the speaker a way to think about what's happening to her. Is that beautiful image one of the things that begins to turn her approach to her baby? Is seeing the two of them mirrored and bound in time, one life lengthening as the other shortens, is this the birth of love? I think so. But I'd also note that in stanza 5, the speaker finds her sense of humor, which has been pretty much absent from the poem thus far, when she says, "One cry and I stumble from bed, cow-heavy and floral, in my Victorian nightgown." Now, it's not flattering to herself, right? Cow-heavy and floral. I think she's got a raised eyebrow about this outfit and the weight that she's gained, and thinking about milk as well. And she's been comparing the baby to something not human, to some animal. And so we didn't look at the part where the baby's like moth breath and it opens its mouth like a cat. It licks its tongue moves around the mouth. So now she's an animal too. So there's a little more commonality. We are both made something other by what has happened to us. We're both transformed. All right. Therefore, the morning song at the end, now that these subtle transformations are taking place, she's ready to, the baby's singing. Your clear vowels rise like balloons, beautiful image. But the sense of pleasure and wonder in those O sounds, notes, vowel, balloon. We say oh when we're delighted. We say oh when oh. I mean, it's exclamation, it's pleasure, it's joy, surprise. The morning song is the poem, also the poem we've just read. It's what the baby's saying. You know, but it's also what the speakers say, writing this for us, you know, in which the speaker, through her mastery of metaphor and music and their implications, she's wrought a transformation in herself from this cool uncertainty about the other to an acknowledgement and appreciation of their common position as makers and singers. They both make something out of sound. So that's all. Yeah. Hopefully that's a little insight anyway into one of the poems of hers that is characteristically affirmative. Not characteristically, uncharacteristically affirmative. Yeah. It's been a long time. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah, sure.
Anyone have a question for Mark? Yes.
Read your Wallace Stevens poem the other day, blew me away. I missed that. It was a brilliant poem.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. A different poet from Sylvia. Anyway, what was your first Sylvia Plath encounter?
Oh, undergraduate, I think, and we read Daddy, and I think we read Lady Lazarus too. And what strikes me now is they were presented as absolutely in earnest. You know, that she felt these things, she had done this, opening her veins and spilled this on the page, and how profound that was, and how unusual to be able to do that. And that's a deeply misguided position, because they are works of art. They are made things, and they are. Nobody talks like that. I mean, it's a performance of self as this wild, mad, driven character, which is really, I think, pretty clearly established by the rhythms and the rhymes that, you old black shoe, you do not do black shoe, that whole thing that is very witchy and over the top. Yeah. So it was a misguided approach. As if the poem only existed to vent anger, basically.
Yeah. Interesting.
To me, beside the imagery and especially those sounds, open vowel sounds, the tension in that poem is the thing that I think is, to me, the defining element, because it encapsulates or captures the ambivalence of a parent who is simultaneously feeling this overwhelming sense of connectedness, but also an awareness of the eventual distance that will define their relationship, and how to protect that child against those elements.
Right. Well, that's interesting, because I hear the distance in the beginning as a distance from wanting to be in that role at all.
Right.
I'm not sure I want to take this on.
Right.
But you're right. That image of being effaced as the child grows older is one that would suggest there's a later problem too.
Also, that baby is about to be 63 years old on Saturday.
Is that Lauren? That's Frida. It's not okay. Yeah.
That's Frida's 63. Her daughter is now 63.
Yeah, that watch it is fine. Yeah.
That's what the form of the baby there is. Frida 63.
Nicholas is no longer alive, living. Yeah. I thought the poem was about Nicholas too. I don't know why I thought that. Okay. Okay.
Well, Nick wasn't born yet.
Okay. I just didn't. Yeah. Okay.
There's also in Baby in the Barn.
This is such a drama of a movement in the imagery in that poem and a movement in tone that never reaches toward making a statement. She does not need to tell us that she is now ready to accept a feeling of common ground and of affection for this child. She just lets it happen. Oh, okay. Okay. So your breath among the flat pink roses. Okay, cool. Makes sense.
One more question.
Yes.
Hi.
Hey, hi.
Hey.
Hey, hi, hey.
Okay. I like the retelling of the morning song. And I was wondering, do you feel like it connects to the daddy song, and is there any regrets that she has about her perspective on her son, or not her son, but her child that she gave birth to?
I think they're in different, far distant rooms of the house, because Daddy is so full of rancor about the way that she was parented. But the speaker in Morning Song isn't worried about, I don't think, about doing it. She's worried about being connected to this thing. What is this thing at all? She's not saying, can I be a good enough parent? It's more like, what do I do? Who am I? Who is this? It's that weird feeling of dislocation that you get sometimes when you in a heightened state when you just don't recognize yourself, or you don't think about your capacities because everything is so peculiar.
But do you think the lack of her father's like reassurance and everything that she went through her childhood causes her to feel that certain way because of that?
I don't know. It would have to raise real questions, right? Because I don't have children, but I have had plenty of students, let me tell you. And, even there, I mean, you sort of care about their future, sort of. And one cares about their future. There are people you want to sort of sponsoring. And people who stick with you for a lifetime, and this number gets bigger and bigger as you age. And so, this. So, letters of recommendation. My point is that you're asking, what is my point here? I got distracted by that aside. You can't help, if you're in a position of guiding or parenting, to reflect on your own childhood, right? It's just going to call things back, and you see mirrored in the kids something that you yourself remember in some way. So inevitably so. But Daddy is such a big caricature on the wall, right? If you're thinking about, the villagers never liked you, and you're a fat black heart, and you're a vampire, and you're not going to apply that kind of thing to yourself, I don't think. It's a bold cartoon, It's like Basquiat next to a much more careful and attentive, different kind of attention sketch. Mary Cassatt could do an image of Morning Song, right?
Mark, can we end with one? It's a big question, but you have to give us a short answer.
Okay,
How has Plath affected your work? The panel earlier talked about it. How has Plath affected you?
My connection to affecting my work would just be, I'm in awe of the density of her lines. So you look at this one, we could spend so much time unpacking other nuances of this poem that we haven't had time to talk about, and how word choice, it makes such a difference, and the way that little collisions of sound catch our ear. It's beautifully nuanced, and I think very few of us at this moment work the line to that degree of intensity. I mean, who can you think of whose lines are packed in that way? It's pretty rare. And it's not, I'm not saying every poem should be like that, but to have the capacity to do that when you want to, that seems to me a marvelous thing.
Thank you. Mark Doty, thank you. Thank you, thank you.